Tuesday evening greetings, and hope that this little video message finds everyone doing well. Um, we are preparing actually for reading with the rector tonight, but wanted to share a quick reflection, actually probably not so quick, but a reflection on coming together and what it means to come together. Our reading selection for the month of September was The Faith Club, and a book that I would commend to anyone to read to have a better understanding about what it means when we come together across those artificial man-made boundaries that we have to be able to accomplish that which we believe is God's purpose for us, being united in spirit and in truth, and being able to love one another as neighbors and as children who are made in the image and likeness of God. And this book calls to mind a couple of things for me. Right now, our Jewish neighbors are celebrating Rosh Hashanah, beginning of a new year, and all of the things that come for all of us with the celebration of a new year and new beginnings and fresh starts. A few years ago, we did a series here at St. George's called The Children of Abraham, and it was an interfaith dialogue where we had a couple of rabbis and a couple of imams and a couple of Christian ministers, all looking through this Abrahamic lens to see what we learn about our traditions and about one another, and about the things that we share in common and the things that sometimes we may just overlook that we share in common. It was a wonderful series. And in our very first evening together, one of the rabbis shared with me that part of the readings for Rosh Hashanah were the readings of Hagar, which surprised me because I've, over the course of my lifetime, heard so many Christian ministers kind of be dismissive of Hagar and say that it was never intended. God didn't intend for the promise to be fulfilled through her. She was a foreigner. She wasn't of Abraham's people. And that was the explanation that people could kind of too easily give for Hagar and Abraham's firstborn son being dismissed and thrown into the desert, ostensibly to die. And that was never satisfying to me. And as I began to study the text of Genesis 21 a bit more critically, that wasn't what I saw of that text. And so it was wonderful to hear a rabbi talk about the fact that part of the Rosh Hashanah readings included this reading from Genesis 21 about Hagar as a reminder of those things for which we need to atone and things for which we need to ask forgiveness as we come into a new year and we come into a new season of our lives. Remembering the things that we just got wrong. For those who aren't super familiar with this text from Genesis, Abraham and Sarah have received the promise from God that Abraham will have many descendants, as many as the stars in the sky and the sands on the shore. There will be many descendants, but time passes and Abraham and Sarah are not young persons anymore. And it feels as though the promise will not be fulfilled through them because Sarah is past her childbearing years. And so worried that they must be missing something, that the promise isn't going to be fulfilled, Sarah gives her slave woman Hagar to Abraham so that he can have this promised family through her. And Hagar does indeed conceive and bears Abraham's firstborn child, a child named Ishmael. And all seems to be well for a bit. I mean, there's a little bump. I often tell people that everything you want to know about humanity and the things that we think and do as humans, you can probably find in the book of Genesis. And of course, there's some jealousy and a little bitterness and resentment between these two women. But things settle down. Ishmael grows into a young man. And Sarah finally has that child. By this time, Abraham's 100 years old. And suddenly this child is here. Isaac, laughter. And Hagar and Ishmael's usefulness to Abraham and Sarah is over. There's no more usefulness. Sarah is just very concrete in telling Abraham, this child will not inherit with my child. This won't happen. And we see one of the darker moments in the book of Genesis when Abraham takes his firstborn son and his mother out of the encampment with minimal provisions and leave them in the desert ostensibly to die. And this could look like the end of a story, except it's not at all the end of a story, because God is a keeper of God's promises, even when we are not terribly faithful. And Hagar has gotten a ways away from her son in the desert, wanting to not see him die in the desert heat, when the angel of the Lord appears to her and says, but the promise will be fulfilled. The promise will be fulfilled through your son. Your son will be the head of a nation. And just because Abraham and Sarah have not been able to keep this portion of the covenant doesn't mean that God won't keep this portion of the covenant. And they live and they go on in spite of Abraham and Sarah. Sarah herself has been a woman who has known adversity at the hands of her husband. On more than one occasion, he's lied about who she was, put her in harm's way with other men. It's probably a good thing that she was unable to bear children when all of that was going on. There could have been some questions about whose child she was actually bearing. But now, all of this has come to pass. Hagar and Ishmael go on. The slave woman and Abraham's firstborn son go on to know God's promises, just as God has promised. And if we believe, as our Muslim friends believe, that this nation of Ishmaels is the beginning of the nation of Islam, well, then we see how our traditions are intertwined and related. One other thing I want to mention about that is that God could have spoken directly to Ishmael. He's a 13, 14-year-old youngster at this point. And God could have spoken directly to Ishmael. But God chooses to speak to Hagar, a slave woman. He chooses to make the message a message to her, so that she understands that although she has been abandoned by the people who owned her, she had not been abandoned by her God. We don't hear any more about Ishmael until we get to Genesis 25. And we have one cryptic verse in Genesis 25 that says so much about this human relationship. Abraham dies. After Sarah has died previously, Abraham's remarried and he has other children. But when he dies, it's those first two sons. It's Ishmael and Isaac, who come together to bury their father. They've come back from the places where they have gone to live, and they come together in this one little scene to bury their dead. Both of them at this point are scarred by their relationship with Abraham. Of course, Isaac has found himself about to be sacrificed, and surely has come away from that with so many questions about why his father has made that choice. But yet, in the moment that matters, they come back together to take responsibility for that for which they are responsible. They come back, they bury their dead, and they go on from that point, as far as we know, to continue to live their lives. And despite the fact that Abraham may have had some questionable moments with these two sons, they come back in the critical moment to do what they must do. As we approach the commemoration of the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, and we see so many amazing moments of unity that were on display 20 years ago in our country and beyond, and also some troubling moments that we see on display 20 years ago. We are now brought to a place of being able to reflect, to ask some questions, to ask ourselves some questions about today and the pandemic and all of the things that divide us as people. It's not a place that humankind hasn't been before. We've been divided before. We've been hurt before. We've been disappointed before. And in all those ways, we are hurt and disappointed and frightened yet again. And the questions that we can ask ourselves, if we're wanting to learn some lessons from these texts in the book of Genesis, have there been moments in our own lives when we've cast away those persons whose usefulness to us seems to have ended? Have we just cast them aside and said, your usefulness is over, there's no reason for us to continue in relationship with you, and we will cast you away? Do we do that? Do we have moments even today that is our response? And how do we atone for that transgression? How do we remember that a faithful God has not cast us away because it seems that we are not so terribly useful anymore? And the second question that I guess comes up from that is, how do we come together, even in our disappointment, our grief, our hurt, our struggle? How do we come together to do that which needs to be done? How do we bring ourselves together and unite for the things that are important to us, to be able to look at one another as children of God, and to say that we are willing to cross the wide gulfs between us? We are willing to put aside, for the sake of doing what needs to be done, the enmity and the disappointment and the grief and the anger, so that we are united in holy purpose. It's hard. And yet the book of Genesis would call us to remember that this difficult place of having to put aside for just the holy moment all of the things that have hurt us, and to ask ourselves deeply, how do we in this moment see ourselves as kin? And how do we come together? We are fractured. We are divided. We are saddened. And I think our instinct often when we are so disappointed and hurt and grieving and angry is to go away into our silos, to lick our wounds, to isolate ourselves, to not come to the holy place of doing that which God calls us to do. And we are called now to be one people who care for one another, one people who put aside our differences, one people who cross the boundaries that we have made of our own design, and to see the image and likeness of God in one another. That is what we are called to do and be. And may our holy scriptures inform us, remind us, shape us, help us to be the people that God would have us be in this holy moment, in this holy, holy moment when we need one another. May we take the good lessons from 9/11, the lessons of a Gander, Newfoundland, the lessons of people who just took folks in and showed radical hospitality. May we take the good lessons, and may we live into those lessons yet again at this holy time in our lives.